Welcome to the Veritas podcast, where we explore heterodox thoughts on politics, sex and culture with an exciting lineup of international guests. I am your host, Dr. Petra Buskins, and I'll be asking guests, what is it that distinguishes this political and cultural moment? Why isn't the world making sense anymore? What is reality in an algorithmically driven world? How can we regenerate our psyches and societies?
Hi, Edie. Great to meet you digitally, semi sort of in person. I've been reading your work for a while and pretty intensively in the last few days. So welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for inviting me.
I've been reading a lot of your political pieces and your spectator pieces, and I think we sit somewhere that's right around exactly the same in terms of being homeless women from the political left that have kind of, I guess, are hiding out in classical liberalism. I don't know if you'd put it that way. I was always a classical liberal and a lefty, actually, and I don't know if you were, but I was.
Yeah,
but
me too.
I had read a lot of social theory and was on the left in the 90s. Even when you said you did your honours thesis in 1994, I was like, I did my honours thesis in 1994.
Oh, wow, yeah.
And we were reading, and I was in Victoria, but we were reading, and writing similar things, and then having a sort of a different life where you don't always integrate that, because by the time I became a mother, I understood that many of the shibboleths of feminism of the left were all wrong. And there was somewhere where I read, you said, I was writing these essays, passionately Marxist, with going to church and feeling actually loved and valued by the people there, but not saying it. And I thought that's not dissimilar to my experience of duality, where I was actually writing my thesis and being with women in the domestic sphere, yet kind of writing in this way as if I was in that world. In some ways, the best about critical theory is the recognition of dual consciousness.
Well, that's the training, right? That's the training we were given as people who did those kind of degrees back in those days. And although I did humanities, political theory, you do start out your foundation. You do learn all the basic theorists of Western civilization. You do have a very similar basic kind of understanding from the different disciplines. But what we were taught was to bring our personal, and my lecturers were very Weberian. You have to, science is a vocation was one of his great pieces, where this is a science and you've got to leave your ideology at the door. Mm-hmm. You've got to leave your religion at the door. You've got to analyze social trends, political trends, world events, cultures, and try and step back. We can never fully step back, which is what the postmodernists are saying, but we can try.
Yes, yeah.
Just because it's not possible doesn't mean we need to give up, abandon trying to put your own religion aside and saying, okay, what's this person saying? Can I think about this in a critical way without saying, what would Jesus do? And, what would Jesus do might be the right question. When you've got an ethical problem at the shop, you've accidentally walked out with an item and they've undercharged you or something like that. But what would Jesus do is not necessarily the right question when you're facing political issues. So, we were able to separate that. But now everyone wants to centralize their ideology with their politics, their personal ideology. They want to sort of line all these things up that aren't necessarily designed to line up, particularly in a liberal society. And in fact, that's the liberal project. The liberal project is to have a secular society where we tolerate each other's religion, but we don't center one and impose it on other people.
Well, I think the separation of church and state that happened in the Enlightenment is absolutely fundamental, whether you're religious or not, to developing precisely that tolerance and that neutral public sphere. And so many things flow from that in terms of cultural flourishing, in terms of the liberty of the individual, but what that then creates in terms of entrepreneurship, wealth, creativity, art. I mean, there's just so much that comes from it. But I mean, Weber's an interesting one, isn't he? Because he, on the one hand, advocates that hold yourself in abeyance. And I still remember from my undergrad, Verstehen, that German word that means understanding. And he said, you can't gain Verstehen if you are putting yourself in the frame. You have to put yourself out so you can understand. And they use a lot in anthropology. How do you understand the so-called outsider or the other if you can't relativize your perspective. But the other thing he said was this scientific machine ends in a kind of totalitarian technocracy, his iron cage. What does it look like at the end point of rights? We want them, and we do need to relativize our perspective, and that is the liberal project, but there's a shadow. And unfortunately, that's where the right populists grab that and say, we've got an answer for you, and it looks like religion. And the woke do it too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's right. And the conservative says this conservative, I heard Peter Credley the other night talking about the conservative versus classic liberal debate, which has always existed on the right. And it's existed on the left. My parents were working class. They weren't Marxists. They used to think that Marxists, I've said before, that they used to think that Marxists were people who had too much education to be useful.
Yeah, I like that. When I read that in one of your pieces about Henry Lawson versus Banjo Patterson, I laughed a lot because as a kid I learned Mulgabill's Bicycle by heart. Oh, do tell me I'm in the Banjo Patterson set. But
my mother was like a very more rude version of Australian feminist. It's not so white tongue.
Germaine Greer,
sorry. So, we used to be able to have this kind of complexity of opinions.
Yeah.
And be generally classic liberal, but not, and still be what you were. Like we were working class. My mother was very skeptical of middle class. I'm still skeptical of middle class. I've been watching Downton Abbey again, and the upper class, both the upper class and the working class were skeptical of the middle class. And we had this kind of view. And it's just culture, right? It's not proper ideology. I mean, you could say it's hateful. You could say it's pitching one people against the other. But we all come from a perspective. And there's no point in abandoning it either. The perspective we're from. I have a classic liberal perspective because that's how I grew up. That's the perspective I took at university. That's the project that I've always kept on. And I've got a Christian perspective because that's who I am. That's what's been important in my life. So I don't pretend to walk outside of that. Some people pretend to be above what they are, what they're taught, what their ideology is. You can't. If you've got a bias, you've got to declare it. You've got to say, well, this is my position. In this postmodern world, everyone's not declaring their position. And they're making stuff up, which is one of the things when I came into the gender critical world, people like Colin Wright, him and I had this discussion before he blocked me for a while. He was saying, well, centrists make up their own mind about issues as they come. All right. So what framework are you using? Like they say that they don't have a framework. So are you smarter than all the political theorists that have come before us?
Well, it's a lie. It's like the notion of mankind that feminists unpacked, or, when my kids had cultural day, you're always wearing some other culture because you don't see your own. The reality is it's not real that they don't have a perspective, but they've neutralized it by virtue of it being dominant.
Yes, that's right. They say things like, they're criticizing feminists. Where the feminists are having conflict in the gender critical world is with gays. And they're saying, like Andrew Doyle's come out and said it's because we're homophobic. Actually, it's because we're against drag. And there's a long-standing feminist critique about drag and surrogacy.
I'm going to pause you there because that's my fourth question. And that's just so huge and so big and so interesting. We're going to go back to it. Sure. I reckon we should start now with your backstory, because you've been referencing and flagging that you're from the working class and you had working class perspective, but also classical liberal. And I think it's really interesting. You wrote this article in Quillette and I read it then. And you know what? I didn't realize that was you now because there's so much has happened in the world, hasn't it? And I was reading Quillette then because, of course, the whole heterodox media space is much bigger now with Unheard and The Critic and everyone on Substack. So, but Quillette was really the only place at that point. So it was huge. And I read that and found it very powerful. And I wondered if you were comfortable to speak to that, your experience as a little girl. And, I cried reading that article again yesterday. It was just very moving, holding your cousin in your arms and what cousin lived with in terms of sexual abuse. And I was thinking, in some ways, it's like a hillbilly elegy story. I mean, not that I'm saying you're J.D. Vance, but just, it was poignant, it was tragic, but it was a North Star in terms of you sublimating that is the political woman you are today.
Yeah. Well, and I think I remember the time when I wrote that. I think it was during COVID. It might have been,
It was 2020, early 2020.
yeah, it was around that time. And I had just come out of a long period of, I had what my mother would have called a nervous breakdown, what the doctor called reactive depression.
Okay.
So I couldn't work for a period of time. My nervous system essentially collapsed. And I was rebuilding myself. And when you do that, you start to go online. I've got a friend who said he can't watch the news after he had a episode. But I sort of dug into that, and I think it was Jonathan Kay who was saying, look, we want submissions. And I thought, okay, I'm going to say my thing in this, because as I was watching the trans activists, when they said that they wanted to give intimate care, for me, it had been years. It was not only with my cousin Nikki, but with my mum, with my sister Andrea, who also had Huntington's disease and who had cancer. Just being in nursing facilities and psych wards and all these places and watching their bodies degenerate to the point where you have to wipe their mouth. I'd be doing their nails and providing that sort of care. And then, of course, they lose their toileting ability and they have to be looked after in that way.
Yeah.
And I thought, no.
Well, it's the same in the birthing unit. It's the same in domestic violence shelters. Edie, can you tell us a bit about your background? Like, for my listeners who probably aren't familiar with it, you grew up in you were born in the early 70s, and like me.
Well, I grew up in a public housing estate. The estate wasn't the word. The estate I was in, my grandmother got the house because my grandfather had been in the war. He'd been in the First World War. So they were allocating high, and she'd been homeless. Her husband had Huntington's disease and died of that. They were homeless, and in those days there were massive housing projects, and they were allocated this house that my parents eventually got a state assisted mortgage on. And sort of we grew up in this housing commission estate. So there was a tremendous amount of freedom, you can imagine running around. But I also I was sexually abused by someone in my household. And so you kind of living in this hell, but escaping with your siblings and with your cousins. But my mother was very close to her sister. They both had the gene that caused Huntington's disease, so they're both crazy as wheels. And my mother was an alcoholic.
Yeah,
My father was a Cockney. He was a London Cockney. He had migrated 10-pound pom. So, you're growing up and they're suffering trauma. They're dealing with all the things that they have faced.
And was your father, in that piece that I read,
Yeah.
your father was born in 28 or something.
No, 27. Yeah.
My grandmother was born in 22.
Yeah.
So I'm thinking your parents are kind of already
older.
You're born, and they've got chronic illnesses,
Yes.
lifetime poverty and alcoholism. So you're kind of born into a situation with major chronic ill health and mental health problems.
Yeah. So I remember saying to a friend of mine, when you're a family like mine, you lose people who knew you as a child. So there's very few. And I had a friend around for lunch who we were best friends at primary school one day. And I just said I brought myself up. Yeah. A friend of mine who had known me all my life, and I said to him, I just made a flippant remark, I brought myself up. And she said, you did bring yourself up. Like, she'd come to my house and she saw the way I lived, and we used to cook for us. I used to cook for myself. I'd get my uniform ready. I'd get my clothes ready. Well, Mum wasn't capable, so often I didn't have enough clothes. I would wear my sister's clothes that she'd grown out of.
Is this from primary school?
Yeah, all through. And when I left high school, high school when I was 15, I had to go back to do my senior externally because I had to get out of the house. And I didn't have enough, like, my mother wasn't maintaining my school fees. She wasn't maintaining my uniform requirements. So it was embarrassing to always be turning up to school and you don't have all the things.
Yeah.
And, it's the 80s.
You had a beautiful line. You said it's hard to be invisible when you got the wrong shoes or the wrong sneakers.
Socks.
You're trying to kind of just hunker down and get through and not be seen, but you're very visible by virtue of this sort of
That's right.
the poverty.
But I was a very determined person. My mother was a very intelligent woman despite all the things. And she did teach me about politics. I always loved politics. I was always interested in politics, always interested in history, loved books, there wasn't many books in her house, but I read everything I could get my hands on. And I was determined. to not be sucked in. I felt like I was being sucked into a vortex. And you see the girls in the Housing Commission estate, they're getting pregnant, they're hooking up with these absolute deros. And I did set myself apart. People used to say to me, oh, you think you're better than us? You know, and I used to think to myself, well, I am better than you. I had this arrogance that I can only put down to, you know, my cousins. My cousin Kevin was very gay. He was always lifting the standards of dress. We always have to dress better. My cousin Nikki, when she worked, she was stealing money from her employer. Since she would buy me clothes.
That's the convict story, isn't it? So many who came out were stealing something to survive.
Yeah, that's right.
That puts the crime in some kind of context, doesn't it? Yeah.
Yeah, I never liked it. So then, of course, I became a Christian when I was in my early 20s. So I was determined. I got a homeless benefit. I was studying. This is why I never will neglect the left. I will never abandon them. It was Whitlam, the right, go on about how he was the worst prime minister. He was the one that allowed me to get into university. You know, my scores weren't high. And I had a right-wing friend say, oh, you could have got a scholarship, because they want the smartest of the working class. I was never going to get a scholarship. I had no stable home to study in. My results were very average until I got a stable place and I did well at university.
Oh, that's a very good point. They want the best of the left, but
They want the best of the working class.
The working class, you need a stable home.
And all the dummies of the middle class who run the, you know, the world.
Absolutely.
But, you know, you need to give it I really felt like I needed to give it a shot. And I got into humanities because it was the longest requirement of the university. You know, dummies of the university.
Which is sad, because it shouldn't be the humanities, it's of the dummies.
No, well, I was pretty good at it too. When I got into it, I figured that some of the kids, I was there with some of the middle class dummies too, and who had everything given to them, but they couldn't get into anything else. And they didn't quite understand, some of them didn't quite understand the concepts. It's not, I think humanities is a very noble profession. I know it's corrupted.
Yeah.
But I do think we need to be able to have an academic sort of area where people think about things. That's where liberalism came from. The original liberals, they said, I don't want to get my guys mixed up. Was it Locke who wrote an essay on tolerance?
He wrote a treatise on civil government.
Yeah.
I know he's written other ones on the blank slate, and that might have been.
Yeah, just little things like that. In the middle of us all killing each other, these guys come up and say, well, why can't we just put up with each other?
They only have a blueprint. They also were like, let's actually get civil liberties. Let's democratize the sovereign and all be sovereign. That's incredible.
And America as a project, amazing.
I agree. And it's being eroded. I'm just thinking about, you know, your comment on the humanities. Although there was another thought that I had, and that was in one of the pieces you said, your parents wheeled you out and said, whose birthday do you share? And you'd say, golf. Whitlam. You share a birthday with Golf Whitlam. That's
11th of July. Yeah.
Oh.
And that was the hero of the house. You know, even though my mother had conflicting views about him because he was middle class, she thought that would be the end of the left, the middle class. And she was right. The Labor Party, not the left, but the Labor Party, which is a problem that needs to be solved. But we don't solve problems anymore. We have a group of people who we agree are the elites, and they solve the problem, and we all have to fall into line. Which is not new.
I mean, your mum, the way you bring your mum in, like everyone fell for it except Audrey. I mean, I love the way she spoke it. It seems like your mum had, I know you don't like Marxism, or you were schooled in it and then rejected it. And I feel similarly, but at the same time, we don't like what it turned into. But his point about ideology as creating the inversion of reality, you know, the metaphor or the analogy of the camera obscura that he said, that everything ends up upside down, that's correct. And the dual consciousness, well, that's correct. And it seems to me that your mum has that dual consciousness, which is to say she can't buy the bullshit because it goes so against her lived experience.
Yeah, that's right. Well, it's the problem of the working class, the project of the working class movement, the workers' movement, was to get us out of generational poverty. And that's what I was an example of.
Yes.
You know, and education is key to that. When I was on a homeless benefit, and I had to deal with social workers, and I've developed a dislike for social workers. It's never left me. You're paid for by the state to do your education on the theory that you're trying to bring the creativity out of people who can't afford the education. You're trying to unveil the resources of the working class and the generationally poor. Because if you keep one set of people generationally poor, you're going to miss most of the geniuses. So the concept is that you're supposed to bring the geniuses out. I mean, I'm not sure there was many in my suburb, but still.
I'm curious, you're giving the level playing field, because genius is such a loaded concept, isn't it, in terms of its historical background. But I think what you're trying to do is create a level playing field so those kids with intelligence and drive will make use of that and bring out their talents and abilities, both for themselves and for society at large.
We love the concept that even when I was running Crillette, you loved the concept of this girl who was in every way should have a destroyed life, which is what they say about sexual abuse. And I do have a conflicting view of coming out with sexual abuse stories, because people say it destroys you. And I hate it when they say that, oh, they've destroyed your life. Well, you know, you can recover. I recovered through religion. I found through God and community and forgiveness. And I could talk about that stuff forever as well.
Yeah. Could you talk about it a little bit? I mean, both the recovery and maybe if you're comfortable, because the impression I got was that it was like a decade and you ran away at 15 when this abuser came back into your household. But he was there, he left and then came back. And so you didn't tell your parents or?
No, I told my mother. There was an incident when I was 13 and I told my mother, and then she threw him out of the house. But then she invited him back a few years later.
That's right.
Yeah, there was a tragedy in the family when my cousin committed suicide. For some reason, he came back into the house for the funeral and then sort of never left. And so I was living in this thing again and I had to leave the house. So because she already knew, right, they knew what he was. So she just couldn't. My mother was unable at that stage. Her disease, Huntington's disease, is a long, slow process. The problem with Huntington's disease is they can't deal with complex emotional situations. Right. That is a complex emotional situation. And they can't deal with it. They have a tremendous ability to live in denial.
Yeah.
So women from a Huntington's, I've talked to a lot of psychologists about this. They say that denial is part of the Huntington's condition. We're to the point where I'm absolutely obsessed now. I can't stand denial. I can't handle it. To the point where it's ridiculous, where sometimes you should let people have a bit of denial in their life.
I can't handle it either.
Yeah, that's right. When you get to our age, I think you realize the influence your childhood has. Even if you've tried to run away from it, even if you've tried to mitigate it, even if you've been successful in working out how to, I realize that some things are developed in you in those formative years, and they're part of who you are.
Even if you've managed to transcend or unpack it, it is still part of who you are. And it is interesting how there's a return. You know, the New Ages have all these terms for that, like at 30, it's Saturn return. And I don't know what it is at Crone return, but there's definitely, you know, women's lives are in stages and cycles. And I do think the 50 turning point is a time where their whole life story, if you're not, you know, on a million medications, but if you're basically medication free, if you can be, I think it is this incredible opportunity, again, like the menarche and like motherhood, of a reimagining and a retelling of one's life story. And it sounds like part of that you was about revisiting those early years and what they meant for your life and your political consciousness.
Yeah, what they teach you, right? You can't unlearn that lesson. I can't unlearn the lesson of being a vulnerable child, a vulnerable girl without a place to go. You know, that's and over the years, if you read some of my heroes, one of which is Josephine Butler, who saw the problem of working class girls who are being trafficked into prostitution and the way the government deals with that. Governments are particular structures where they rationalize things. They are not moral entities. Humans are moral entities.
Well, was she an abolitionist? Is she from the 90s?
Josephine Butler was a prostitution abolitionist.
Yeah.
And so she got rid of the Contagious Diseases Act. She worked at that for years and years. And finally, it was her one main achievement of her life where she got rid of the contagious diseases and helped increase the age of consent to 16. She worked with some of the people from the Salvation Army in that as well. And they were coexisting with the suffragettes. But there was a split, right? Like there's factions, which there is in our movement.
Yes.
So the suffragettes were militant, and I really admire them. I'm doing a project at the moment where I'm looking at the propaganda that they produced. but I probably would have been in the other section, the not violent one and the one sort of pulling the girls out of the suffering that society brings. You might call it patriarchy, you might call it the capitalist market, because once you allow prostitution, you're bringing the female body, young female bodies particularly, into the market, which brings, they would say it was a moral evil. So feminists kind of reframe that and say, it's oppression, which is a correct word, I think. I'm not frightened of that word.
It is a moral evil too, though. And that's where,
Yes.
I think it's interesting where on the pointy edges of feminism, let's say prostitution, surrogacy, pornography, sex trafficking, and those issues, we always seem to align with Christians. And feminists are embarrassed about that. And I don't think they should. It's almost
I think some are, but some aren't. I've made a lot of radical feminist friends, especially with the big ultra split in the gender critical world. The women that have reached out to me, and who I'm, sort of become friendly, had private conversations that I wouldn't repeat. Women who would inbox me and say, look, I know we're not on the same team on this other thing, but I'm behind you. Thanks for standing up for this principle. So we're all women, right? We're all, and that's got to be the point. We're all women. We all want to protect girls. And as soon as we align with a corrupted political influence, I don't know what the solution is, but there is a united fight there. There should be. We have to have it.
But it is. And I agree with you. And I think, in the same way we were talking earlier about the separation of church and state, and Weber's idea of holding oneself in abeyance, one's religion or one's political predispositions in order to create a neutral public sphere. We needed that. And I think it was critically important. And until maybe even the 90s, there was a strong bipartisan agreement about that largely. But I think this return of the repressed, to use a Freudian term, there is a return of the repressed, and that is the religion that was repressed, the subjectivity, the values. And this is the point that Weber and a lot of them were talking about. And so what we really see, and I know you write about this in a very compelling way, that it is religion. The woke stuff is religion. And I would say some of the right populism is religion, which is to say it is filling the religion-shaped hole that modernity has left around meaning and purpose and values and ethics. And
turns out you can't kill God, huh?
No, you can't. You can't. Nietzsche was wrong. Well, he was only commenting on it. He didn't agree with it. Like in some ways, and a lot of people don't realize this because everyone's ready to bag feminism, especially at the moment. But feminism, I think, got through the keeper. And I'm going to write about this more. I'm writing a book. But that what happened, feminism retained the values and the ethics and while being a secular discourse as well. Because women were always aligned with the things that were dropped out of modernity, good and bad, irrationality and love, basically. Where that rational woman was irrational. Man was, sublime and sublimated, and woman was earthy and immanent. And, all these dualities. Women inhabited that side. That was projection, but it was also what we actually did in our daily lives, reproducing the species and so on. And so I think what's really interesting about feminism as a discourse is that we aren't split in the way that is causing all these problems out there. We've got there's a duality in the discourse of reason and emotion that actually I think reflects women's lives.
Yeah. And it's complex for a lot of the radical feminists, and I've talked to a few of them about it. I think I talked to Caitlin Roper about this. She does a lot of work on the sex robots and all that sort of thing.
Yeah, I haven't read it yet.
Yeah, she's very good. Essentially, it gets down to the point where you say, okay, so we've got to put a moral in the state, which is what Josephine Butler was saying. We have to have a principle in the state that says there's something that is precious, that is morally important about the female body, the female reproductive system, the sexual system of women that needs to be protected by the state. And that is a moral principle that we have to keep in without the state taking possession of that.
Yeah.
This is the problem we're facing. Yeah. Which is the problem, right? Because essentially the state has purchased feminism. So you won't get a feminist organisation that's funded by the state now unless you say that men can be women. It's impossible. So the state has purchased feminism. We've got to find a way to get that back. I don't know exactly how, but it has to be us. It has to be through feminists. It can't be through anything but a feminist discourse. It has to be a return of feminism to women.
Yeah, but I think at some level, what's happened is, and this is why feminists like Megan Murphy and others say they've rejected feminism. The ism has now got a life of its own. It's become basically in its third wave, intersectional, postmodern, queer version, talking about women's rights. I know that feminism is the movement to secure women's rights and to fight for women's rights as a sex class. But I wonder if it hasn't been so appropriated and bastardized that maybe we just talk about women's rights. And then we're talking about everyone's rights. The difference is because of our unique vulnerability becoming mothers, we need sex-specific rights because we have a sexually differentiated species. That's what I'd say to people because it's interesting, and I want to get to this, we're racing ahead, but the kind of critique that you now see in that podcast world with the bros and a lot of people who are anti-woke in ways that we would be too, blame feminism for the ills of absolutely everything. And they don't really understand that the very freedom and rights they bang on about as being really important, that's all feminism ever wanted for women.
That's right.
But you have that.
No, but it's an infantilization of women's politics too, isn't it? It's saying, we could say men. We could say men's, politics, meninism has destroyed the world. It's responsible for all the wars. We could say all that stuff. It's a silly thing to say.
Yeah.
What they call feminism is just women acting politically. And we're half the population. So why would our politics just require one word? For me, feminism is a very specific thing. It's women working towards the activism, engaging in activism for our own rights. So I won't get rid of the word. No one's convinced me yet to do that. It's like when people say, oh, why do I want a gender critical word? Well, you could say you don't want it, but what else the word? Everyone understands it now. We can't change the name of the movement. When you've got people on television who don't know us very well, but if you say gender critical, they understand what we are.
Yeah.
It's an evangelization. They say, oh, feminism did all these things. Well, yes, if you say that women getting rights did start a different world, yes. Yeah, you could send it back, which is what I said to one guy on the internet today. Before feminism, we had that sex trafficking problem. We had the problem where women couldn't work. We had the problem where we couldn't have a bank account. We couldn't buy property. We couldn't participate. And as you look back at the arguments, I'm looking at a lot of the political cartoons in the US at the moment. And one of the main arguments was, well, you want our taxes. We're working now. This is 1920s or, we're working. You want us to pay taxes, but you won't give us equal citizenship. So it's untenable, that position. And the feminists had to take the state to war on that because it was illiberal and untenable, the idea that women denied rights.
Absolutely. Even up to the 60s, things like rape in marriage being legal or not being able to get a mortgage in their own names. No, absolutely. And what I think with this bashing of feminism, because I'm not going to give up on it either, but I understand the position strategically that some feminists have taken in jettisoning the term and talking about rights because they don't want to be aligned with the postmodern queer version of it, which is actually a theft of feminism. Let's be real here. That's actually masquerading as feminism, but it's a whole other agenda of kind of a concoction of, French post-structural theory, the sexology that was absolutely debauched. It's not feminism.
Well, they use the word to steal their political capital.
Correct.
So, which is what they do in the working class.
What I notice in the kind of podcast world, which you, I think, are one of the few feminists to talk about, and I've certainly been thinking about it for a while now and written about it a little bit, but there's this feminist bashing that is absolutely simplistic because, like you say, if you go and get the receipts, if you actually pin them down and say, this is what it actually means if we get rid of it, well, we remove the suffrage. And I've literally heard now in the kind of New Age podcast, well, what do we want the vote for anyway? It doesn't do anything. You don't actually relinquish your civil liberties. And what are you talking about? A situation like, I just find that it's ridiculously naive to imagine you don't want that. You wouldn't have this little podcast you've got going. You wouldn't be able to earn the income. So I think essentially there's a kind of feminist bashing, but it never is taken to its logical endpoint because if it is, people would find it anathema because at the same time, they'll contrast Western civilization against other cultures as being kind of barbaric and they'll draw attention to the status of women, but that was feminists who fought for that.
It's dumb commentary, right?
Yes.
And that's one of the problems we're facing with the internet. we didn't know what it was going to be like. Everyone tried to put it back in its box. But now, it's out of the box. There's no, years ago they were trying to bash printing presses and hide them and restrict their sale. And, there's none of that anymore. Everyone's got a podcast. Everyone's got a camera. Everyone's got a microphone. And consequently, you get a lot of simplistic narratives that get a massive following that aren't tested, that aren't intellectual. And even if you get Jordan Peterson and even Tucker Carlson, I didn't mind Tucker Carlson when he had his TV show. He was platforming some of the feminists. He was saying some working class sort of narratives. I thought, yeah, that's good. But he was obviously, even though he didn't seem constrained, he was constrained. And then you let him out of the box and all of a sudden you got aliens and you've got, all sorts of things happening.
Quite like Tucker, I must say. I don't like his anti-feminism, but who else is going to platform, diverse world leaders? And it's not about whether you like them or not. I want to hear what Putin's got to say. I want to hear what so-and-so's got to say. I actually feel he's stepped into a vacuum that the legacy media have left. But I fully agree with you that we're in a situation where the internet allows people like us to speak that don't otherwise, and lots of voices. But we've now got this kaleidoscope of dumbness and madness. And what's problematic about it is that if they say the right things and are cool enough, they can get these massive followings, even though their arguments are not that intelligent, or they're plagiarized. That happens a lot too. Or these feminists that kind of burst out of Zeus's head, that they're like Athena, they don't acknowledge a feminist legacy, like someone like Clement Ford. But even some of the post-liberal feminists that are now onto the scene, they never acknowledge their feminist debts.
No. And they're not, they're obviously crazy. And they get on to, she was just on UK program, I can't really go his name.
Who was?
Clementine Ford.
Yeah.
Because she's obviously crazy. People will invite her on because there's conflict, right? And that's one of the problems, all this rage farming that's happening. They get her on because she'll say something outrageous, and it's all that pro-Palestine, free Palestine, it's so strange because now they're siding with Hamas, who are
I think we might sit in different places with that. I don't side with Hamas, but I don't support the bombing of Gaza in the way that it is.
No, I don't. The problem is you can't critique that, right?
The
problem is when you get locked into a dialogue, you can't have a conversation about this stuff anymore.
Yeah, no, she's in fury, and that's the rage farming you say. So she does it on everything, doesn't she?
Yeah, that's right.
T-shirts that say, leave your husband. Now, the reality is for most women who have young children who don't have the kind of salaries she gets because she's funded by all kinds of organisations, if they leave their husbands, that's a one-way ticket to poverty. And I know because I'm a single unmarried mother in my early 20s. And so I just find it absurd as not just a suggestion if you're being abused and how you might find a pathway outside of a very disruptive marriage. I mean, a marriage where, things aren't perfect and she's advocating that. I mean, a lot of her slogans are just so destructive for women.
Yeah, that's right. Well, they're simplistic. And that's what I mean about the Israel example, is that it's a simplistic view for an extremely complex problem.
Yes.
Like I don't have the solution for the Middle East problem. I'm not that smart. Yeah. I'm not even that knowledgeable. But Islamism is a bad thing. I'm married into a Muslim family. I know a lot of Muslim people. I know a lot of people who've got a variety of opinions on the Middle East. But I think that method of government, putting religion in government the way that Islam is being weaponized in government, is a bad thing. And that's because I'm a liberal.
But I would say to you that it's not our business to tell them what to do, and that our own side is deeply problematic in terms of the wars in the Middle East or in South America or...
Oh, yeah. Well, that's another issue. The fact that supporting, even if you look at Afghanistan, we get out of the Middle East, we go to Afghanistan. It's called the graveyard of empires for a reason. The West has funded terrorists.
That's right.
We don't want that terrorists.
Yeah.
And I'm saying that we shouldn't, if we want to support Hamas, it's just the same problem. You're saying, let's support one terrorist over another terrorist. And from a feminist perspective, this is a bad thing. This is causing the oppression of women internationally. When I was in Lebanon a few years ago, they were having a protest. The Lebanese women were protesting that they didn't want to marry the men who raped them. You know, there was some sort of compulsion that they had to marry these men if they were raped. No, we don't want that. And I'm on their side. I'm on this side of the women in Gaza. I am on the side of the women in Lebanon and Afghanistan. Because if you've got a feminist analysis, you have to say, this is the side that we're on. It doesn't mean that we're on the side of Israel. I mean, I'm not on the side of war. Anyone.
Yeah. I mean, I agree with you that feminist analysis is somewhat independent and we can support women in those places with our politics. But my sense is if you dig deep enough, like a lot of these figures or movements like Hamas are funded by the West. You know, they were funded by Israel against the Ayatollah Khomeini, who had a more kind of rational strategy. I'm not saying I think it was great, but I am saying that. Yeah. And likewise with Osama bin Laden was a CIA asset. And so the more you dig, the more it's a hornet's nest, but the West certainly doesn't have clean fingers. But what I do, or clean hands, is differentiate, and I'm sure you're similar, that the idea of the West and the idea of liberal democracy is worth defending to the end. But unfortunately,
first to our own citizens.
Correct. But unfortunately, whatever we want to call it, the deep state, the globalists, the WEF, UN conglomerate, the blob, there's something going on where the West is hijacked to some other agenda that is funded. That is funded from the top, as Billet's work shows, as even, you know, you were talking about in one of your podcasts, that whenever you look at the public policy funding on gender equity, it's coming from those sources that are promoting this kind of post-gender, you know, non-sex world. And so that, whatever that blob is also funding wars, is also, you know, even though I am concerned about the same things you're concerned about there, that I see that as so layered now because the West is embedded. There's a dual West, I guess.
Yeah, well, the UN are developing population templates, management templates. So it's a super government.
Yes.
Where they're saying, okay, this is how we're going to manage human rights. We're going to take it out of the bodies. We're going to put it into identities. And that solves a range of problems for government. Because if you can't see female bodies are so demanding and they're so messy and they're so vulnerable, you know, particularly by sexual violence, and I've experienced that it costs money, right? So the state paid for my education, paid for me to live while I got my education. Although, you know, for years I ran businesses and, you know, obviously I've paid all my tax back. Children, I've got a stable marriage, you know, and part of that's not just due to the state. Part of it's due to the church, finding community, traditional values, finding a way through. And that's, the state doesn't see that because the state doesn't have any moral core. That's why we need democracy. That's why we need democratic accountability. That is the function of democratic accountability, is to keep the state accountable to the people.
Yeah.
Because the people are supposed to be the conscience of the state. And it's not perfect. You know, as Winston Churchill said, it's only just better than the other ones. Which is why what my criticism is about Islam is we have a better system than that for women. It doesn't mean we can go to their countries and bomb the shit out of them and impose our system on them. It doesn't mean that. That's a male solution to a female critique.
Yeah.
It's not, you know, and that's why I try and stay. I do try and stay. I tried not to comment on Israel and Palestine, but I've had to. I feel like I've had to in some senses. Because you do get criticism and you do get people say, well, what about the Israeli women being raped? Aren't you against that? Yes, I'm against that. So, and you do have, I've got a variety of women attacking me now. Some of it's because I've critiqued them. And some of them are in this little, you know, Palestine thing, and they've called me a Zionist and all the rest of it. And I don't want to get into those weeds.
The thing about the internet, to just loop back to that, is it creates this splintering of reality. And I define it as like a mirror, and it's broken and we're all on these shards. And you're on a reality shard, and then that splinters again, whether it's climate change or Israel, Hamas, or we keep being on smaller and smaller shards. And if we're going to use that analogy of the blob again, we're all fighting down here around identity with things we can't actually change. If we could do something about Gazan women and Israeli women, maybe, but we actually can't. So what ends up happening is we're just arguing and fighting. And that then creates this, you know, identitarian conflicts that are endemic while the blob keeps going. with this endless, governance model and management of populations model, and essentially a kind of digital, invisible, silent authoritarianism as our civil liberties are just deconstructed. But I want to take you way back to when you were talking about your mum and how she could sniff out this left hypocrisy, how let's say if the working class and the left were a landmass, they broke. And your mum saw that before they broke. She saw that there was something in the middle class left. And it reminded me of my dad, who grew up in post-war Germany on a farm in a situation where there just wasn't enough food. And he said he went to university and there were all these middle class people talking about Marx. So your mum had this awareness, and you talked about your love of Keating, and if only you could smack yourself if you could go back, because he kind of made, because I love Keating too, of course, and voted for him, the Keatster, we called him. But you were talking about this transformation in the left. Now, we're way downstream. We're living that now. But what do you think happened there, where the working class was cynically used by a middle class left, but now turned everything about class into identity, about bodies into gender, about, so that was this shift, because it didn't just happen in feminism, it also happened in working class politics. And arguably, I think it's happened to the civil rights movement too, where you've now got a kind of black politics that had nothing to do with what Martin Luther King was talking about. So,
I think it's exactly the same.
So can you speak to that?
Yeah. I think one of the things I've said to some of the blood grass group, I say to them, well, why don't you say that to civil rights people? Why don't you say that civil rights caused all these problems?
Yeah.
Which they wouldn't,
No.
because some of the civil rights activists were big, strong black men, people like famous comedians and people who are cool and tough and will destroy you with their massive audiences.
Yeah, they get Netflix festivals and films like What is a Woman?
That's right, yeah.
Oh.
So I think it's been funding. I think it's a very ordinary system. And the reason my mother saw it is because working class politics is very simple. The reason it became successful is because it's very simple. It's the reason why I think I will have said before, why Kelly Jo Keane is very successful. She has very simple points. She says them every time she gets up. She says, this is what we're saying. And she says 5 or 6 things. And that's what the movement centers around. We are generationally oppressed. We are generationally poor. We have no opportunities to go to university. We have no opportunities to better ourselves. Even an intelligent woman like my mother was a cleaner her whole life. There was never any opportunity for her. She had to go to work. Her father was sick. She had to go to work and, fought against it her whole life. It's a struggle. So these are our demands. We want access to education. We want to be, and so once they're met, we saw it became cool, and you would have seen them at university too, the middle class lefties, and they're going to free the world. At the time, they were talking about the internationalization of the proletariat, and they were going to take the struggle internationally, which would have been very cool. But they didn't. They took it inward to identity. And I think some of it was funding. I've talked about how when I was at university, they wanted to make, this was a Keating government, they wanted to make sort of the humanities vocational. We had to sing for our supper. So they started to make policy, or we'll make policy for you.
I love that turn of phrase. It couldn't be a turn of phrase, Edie. We had to sing for our supper. But they wanted to professionalize it. It's this horrible careerism that crept in. APIs, APIs and, humanities in one sentence. I'm sorry.
And equity. I had a friend who did the same degree as me. She went to equity. She made a huge amount of money. She was an equity expert. And therefore, they make the policy, that the government pay for the policy that they want. So they become the consumer. It's not the people, it's the government. So you're developing policy for the government. You're not developing policy for the people. So you get this set of experts, and we have it right across the board. We have these experts. Okay, we saw it here with self-ID. When self-ID came in, they put it to this panel, which was corrupted. The process was corrupted. We're going to talk to trans people about this. We're going to change sex categories in law. We're going to talk to trans people about it. And that there's a group of women who are hiding their transphobia in feminism. So it's the narrative. They pay for the narrative, which is what we see in the States. Kit and I did a podcast about this a couple of years ago, I think, about these narrative generation companies in the States. And you never hear of the people, but they made one narrative which was called the race, class, gender narrative. The race, class narrative. So they made race like class. So to make it understandable to people, this is the oppressed group. And then they change it to gender. And their research was very clear that it was successful. They've got these massive research institutes where they find out whether it's going to be sold to the people. But then they got to sport and they couldn't sell it. And they kept trying to sell it and they couldn't sell it. So the UN have these policy templates. They get tested by these experts, these, now paid humanities people.
There's so many experts now. I mean, there's literally an industry around it. I mean, I've got a friend who worked in the US aid world that got cut. And she said it's hard to get a job now because there's so many people that got cut from Doge that are looking for jobs. And they're exactly the kind of people that we went to uni with that we were supposed to become but didn't. We became sort of cranky, recalcitrant dissidents instead. This proliferation of these kind of university minted KPI speaking, they all speak corporate speak, and now the academics speak corporate speak too. I say to academics in the system now, tell me the difference between a government report and an academic journal article. I can't see any difference. Then they look the same because the funding is the same, the language is the same, and they used to look very different.
Just look back to the reference.
That's
The
right.
references, they're the same.
If you read Weber and a government report at the same time that Weber was writing, that wouldn't look the same. It wouldn't look the same because scholarship was not just filling for the government. And so you're absolutely right. And I think the hijack is that, yes, we were singing, what did you call it? Singing for our
Singing for a supper.
Yeah, all the humanities and social science graduates went into this big government blob and became this expert and that expert. But the university changed at the same time too and became itself an arm of government, because that's when all the funding came in, and those grants, there were only 5 subject areas. So knowledge was no longer an end in itself.
No.
And one of them was sustainability and another was gender equity. And, this sort of language, this corporate speak language, and then academics just like sheep. I couldn't believe it. I was appalled. Just went on with that. And I had to discipline repeatedly in order to write about mothers, because the category of woman was disappearing under my feet. I literally had to leave women's studies because the category of woman died there first.
Disappeared.
Yeah. And that was a fight when women's studies became gender studies. And then I moved to sociology. I sort of did social theory and packed it onto the social philosophy I'd done. But because they still talked about women and mothering work and care work and domestic division of labour and all that stuff, I had to discipline hop because the category of woman was evaporating under my feet. And I find that fascinating to look back on now, because that's all part of what's happened here. The working class was stolen by this sort of glamorous corporate left, but women's studies was stolen too. And I think, so feminism is all rolled into one. Wollstonecraft's the same as Judith Butler. No, she's not, actually.
No. Well, that's infantilizing of women's studies as well. Because what they do when you talk to people, like, not that I talked to James Lindsay, he blocked me years ago, but people like that will say, oh, look, here's a feminist, and this is what they said. But feminism is an entire academic discipline.
Yeah, that's right.
Women think different things and have different schools of thought, just like men do. And to have to explain that to these guys, you can't evidence that feminism is the fault of this by getting the words, because no one listened to women before.
No,
why do you think they're listening to them now? Like, they're only listening to the ones they pay to say what is meant to be said. So, and then you get these liberals, like these guys who call themselves classic liberals. And I remember saying to one guy, he said, well, that's a bit, conspiracy theory. I said, well, don't you believe that the state will inherently corrupt? He said, no. And I said, well, that's the basic tenet of liberalism. The basic tenet of liberalism is that the state will corrupt if you let it by itself. That's why we have the checks and balances.
That's right. Yes.
It's not perfect. We know that it's not perfect. But if it's not accountable to the people, if you replace the people with consultants and the consultants are paid by the government's going to end up paying for the advice that they pay for, getting the advice they pay for.
Yes.
So Kit's done a lot of work on ACON, and that's a perfect example.
That's the Gay and Lesbian organisation, isn't it?
It used to be the Council for New South Wales AIDS Council.
Yeah, that's right.
Yes, but now it's the sort of peak equity and diversity organisation. But it's a shit show. It's absolutely a perfect example of the kind of consultancy that government, and they have a problem, something happens, gay guy gets murdered, God rest their soul. The government can, let's give more money to ACON, because that's how we're going to deal with the problem. We're going to deal with the problem by basically paying these people, and then they'll create brochures. They'll create awareness campaigns. We see that with the whole, okay, how are we going to solve the problem that women who pretend that they're men are not getting cervical screening? Okay, we're going to create a campaign. So you're putting more money into campaign management, into advertising, into creating posters. And the worst example, I think, is primary prevention, the doctrine of primary prevention that's right through our domestic violence services. And so we say that the primary reason, the primary driver for violence against women is basically toxic masculinity, is what they say, gender inequity. And so it's cultural. So, and there is a correctness in that. There is a truth, and there's a truth at the base of most of these things. But then they take them to the extreme where you've got organizations that are paid $10 million to write shit that the UN pumps out and make recommendations that are mirrored internationally. And to make domestic violence shelters and rape shelters mixed sex. It's a disaster. It's an absolute disaster.
Now, don't they? I mean, it came out in COVID, lockstep. It's like, why is the policy at my local council identical to this, some little tiny town in Spain, their local council, and the same as them? Because it's coming from the UN. It's the language was all the same in COVID. The language is all the same and it's funded. But I think what you're saying there is even more interesting, is that they're essentially paying for their own points of view through the proliferation of the consultant who works for them directly or indirectly. And it's like a closed system with a hermetic seal. And I think that's why people are starting to say, why is it that we can't vote this out? Because there's corporate capture of the culture industries and the institutions and even the institution of government.
Yes. You end up with Trump, right?
Yeah.
So that's what, with the hammer.
Yeah, he's the hammer. He's the left nightmare. But the reality is, I think that there's a pretension, and I wonder what your mother would have thought of this, but that there's this anti-populism. Populism is democracy by another name. I know it's other things too, like nationalism, and we may not like some jingoistic elements, but it is nonetheless democracy by another name. They don't like democracy when it's not their team. So although I find Trump gratuitous and revolting in a lot of ways, I also like that he can do, the way he just laughed with his executive orders. I was laughing along when he said there's two sexes.
Just got to do this.
Yeah, just
let him do what you think.
That's right. I've heard a lot of people say on the ground, none of that's actually happened. So there's an executive order, but in the sort of rabbit warren of the bureaucracies, it hasn't actually happened.
I think as Musk also left his company a little bit as well. I think the first time Trump was going to drain the swamp, he got no draining done.
No,
I think the second time he thought he'd come in with the hammer. I think it's very difficult to solve. The problem we've got with government, this new form of government corruption, is very difficult to solve.
And the lefties, who purport to be about, the critique of power, they're all on board. I thought I'd ask you just about the conflict, because we're nearly at an hour and a half actually, but I thought I'd like to talk to you also about, we've talked a little bit about the blaming feminism, but about the conflicts inside gender critical feminism. I'm not really au fait with those, but can you tell me a bit about that? Like, starting with, I guess there's a few different critiques. One that you have of Helen Pluckrose's version of liberalism that she enunciates in Cynical Theories. And then, because you had an analysis of that, I thought was very interesting, the lack of an understanding of feminism in a sense and what feminist politics was. But the other side of that being the critique of Genspect. And as a therapist, it's another hat I'm kind of tangentially linked to Genspect. And I noticed, just digging into it slightly, literally in the last 24 hours, people say that feminists that are critical are kind of playing a purity politics. But can you talk a little bit about the conflicts internal to the sort of dissident, contrarian, feminist, sex-based rights movement?
Well, there's a few of them. I mean, there's going to be purity politics at some point. And I think feminism, academic feminism is subject to that. I'm not an academic feminist. I'm a grassroots feminist. So I try and stay away from it a bit. I've got good mates who are radical feminists, but I'm not. I'm not a radical feminist. I'm ideologically in a different position.
Mm-hmm.
But with the podcast bros, I think we're facing that click rage farming, who's popular. There is a little bit of controlled opposition there.
Would you be willing to name names?
Well, if we just go back to Helen Pluckrose, the thing is, her and Peter Boghossian and James Lindsay is Blockley. So that's a trilogy of them that I've come against because they've got a very simplistic populist, not populist. It's a very simplistic approach. And there's a class division. And that's the thing about traditional structural analysis. If you've got class analysis on some of this, you can see that there's kind of a middle class. Okay, this is a line we're going to take. We're going to look at this person's view and that person's view. We're going to meet in the middle. But that's not what feminism is. Feminism is supposed to center the female. And that's my analysis. It's the feminist centered to the interests of women. So Helen Pluckrose denies the oppression of women. So they all say we don't agree with oppression. We don't agree with oppression. Fine. But the problem is women are oppressed, structurally oppressed. That's the starting point of feminism, is that women are structurally oppressed and that they need protection in government. That's what I was saying before. We're subject to trafficking, especially young female bodies in the market. These are all big problems. And we've seen historically that if we allow women to be put in the market, that the market will exploit them. We allow government to release the protections for women, that men will exploit them, that they'll become subject to oppression.
Yeah.
Apart from equal rights, we need ability to separate ourselves from males.
Yes.
We need workplace protections. We both know how the workplace has changed since we've seen sexual discrimination laws. These are all sex-based protections, which are all based on the fact that women, because of their reproductive role, become vulnerable to poverty or to sexual violence or male violence or whatever. A protection from male pattern violence. But to do that, you have to acknowledge that women are subject to vulnerability and you have to acknowledge male pattern violence.
Yeah, that's something that's shifting. Now, I think we can put it in context of poverty and job loss and historic changes that have happened to working class men's employment, but it doesn't matter that there is male pattern violence and there seems to be an emergent discussion that doesn't exist. I find that strange indeed. There's reasons why it exists, but we can't deny it exists.
You're gone? Oh, yeah, I can see you now.
Can you speak to where you were at, where we were?
I think I was at Chesterton's fence. We say some of those things are better now, but they're there because we put these protections in place. It doesn't mean we can remove the protections. That was my beginning conflict.
Something fence.
It's when you've got a fence, and someone says, "Why do we need this fence here?" Yeah, and of course you remove it, you find out why you need the fence.
Find out why you needed it. Yeah.
So, and I think that was my original argument with Helen Pluckrose. And I said to her, you can't deny, once you deny the oppression of women, we've lost it. And I had the same argument so she started to, then she rebutted it, and she was obviously protecting some of these trans-identified males. And then Stella O'Malley got involved in that. She was obviously messaged to get involved. And so she liked and retweeted that reply. And I said, why would she like and retweet this explanation she's got? Denies the oppression of women. So then we part on this issue. If you're going to deny the basis for my theory, that's fine, but you've got to give a proper academic critique.
Are you saying that Genspect, I wasn't aware of this, are you saying Genspect does not hold feminist politics? Is that what you're saying?
If that's true, it doesn't. No. Well, that platform, Michael Bailey. I think Michael Bailey not only advocates for reduced sentences for pedophiles. I mean, I shouldn't laugh about this, but he actively on Twitter openly advocates.
He's a sexologist, isn't he?
Yeah, I think so. So he also says that there is no evidence that the reason he advocates for reduced sentences for pedophiles is that he says that the harm that's done through sexual abuse of children is not enough to cause serious trauma in the adult. He said there's no evidence for that. So that's, for me, that's such a dodgy theory that I wouldn't go with 10 feet of that guy. That's past nuance. So I tried to have a series of I thought they were very reasonable discussions.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, they degenerated very quickly for reasons I thought were suspicious.
Mm-hmm.
So they all blocked me. Yeah, they're all blocked me. And Kathleen Stockton retweeted my critique and said, to Stella, you should mute this thread. There was a whole moral panic at the time of gender critical women reading criticisms. So it started really with Janice Turner, and she used wrong sex pronouns for David Hayton. She called him a she. Then she defended it. But then she was criticised by the women. And this is where you've got a class issue in our movement. Particularly it's showing the UK where the classes, I was blocked and soft blocked by orange people, but no one from Australia. No one of my political movement here who I know and interact with. So you get this, they start to circle the wagons around each other. Not through a doctrine, and this is where it's more postmodern, but through an aesthetic idea that we're going to find a middle ground on gender. And this is where, and then we had the issue in the UK of the Gender Recognition Act, which is an act which protects a certain small cohort of men who go through a transition process and they can be acknowledged in law as females in some contexts.
They won't acknowledge trans-identifying men in inheritance law.
I can't remember what there's a big word for it when they're going to become a lord. So trans-identified females can't become
a lord.
So they blocked it. That was one of the exceptions they put in. So
that's fascinating. Yeah,
that's past issue.
Yeah,
as well, right? So they want to keep this a lot of them want to keep this Gender Recognition Act. And ultimately I said to him, look, Dennis, I can't, if you're going to have a fight with your people about the GRA, I'm on the other side. So you just need to understand that if we're going to be friends, you need to understand that I'm on the side of repeal. Even though I'm not from the UK, it's a principle. I don't want gender of identity in the law at all. I think it's dangerous to women. So this is my position, my political position. And then we had that argument with Janice Turner. He called me extreme. So I was extreme because they said that they were going to find a middle ground. This was the philosophy that Genspect, that Pluckrose, that a lot of those guys were coming forward. We're going to find a middle ground, but those people who want sex to be just sex and won't use cross-sex pronouns, wrong sex pronouns in certain contexts, they're extreme. So I sided with basically the working class women
who weren't prepared to betray sex for gender.
Yes, that's right. Well, they called them ultras. And so I was then called.
I miss a lot of this. My feeling is there is a political fight, but it's refracted through the medium of Twitter, which turns it into something else. Because
it looks like a personal fight.
Correct. You should be able to have that political disagreement without it becoming just this war of all against all.
That's right. Well, it was that until then Rudy came out and called me. He said it was like a Nazi. And then Colin Wright liked that, a few other people liked that. And even one woman who had been complaining about anti-Semitism, she was right on the Israel side, got on the poll line. I said, 5 minutes ago, I was defending you on the Jews issue.
That's what I mean about the mirror of reality breaking, and you're on a shard and you think you're with someone and it breaks again and again and again. So we'll end up relating to all as I don't know, 3 people.
It's suspicious, right? So it becomes suspicious. And I think, well, all of a sudden I'm an extremist, people who were praising me, sharing my articles. Helen Joyce was sharing. And this is what I wanted to say about sexual assault, coming out with your story of sexual assault. I wrote a letter to one of the judges. Helen Joyce praised it. She was always sharing my articles. She was, when I had my sexual assault story, lots of sympathy. Mm-hmm. As soon as I come out with a political opinion and side with the plebs, you're dead to them. Because they want to weaponize your oppression, your abuse
when it suits.
But when it suits them. And then as soon as you come out and disagree with them, they'll say, well, she's a bit broken.
Oh, well, that's really unpleasant. Yeah.
It is unpleasant.
I feel a lot too. It's this sort of, they psychiatrize your critique. It's the misuse of the sci industry, really. And it's something that the sci industry does over and over. It pathologizes political critique. You must be crazy. You must be broken. Whereas a minute ago, you were using lived experience.
That's
Just
right.
their argument. But I can see what you mean about class, because the other thing I've noticed is there's definitely, and I, have had back channel discussions with a number of these women because I'm putting together an anthology. There's camaraderie until this, like the fame funnel happens. And who gets in that, I find, is completely arbitrary. Their opinions are no more sophisticated than yours or mine. Often there's less educational background, and they just take off. And then the like machine and the rage machine becomes an end in itself. And it's no longer about the argument, it's about the popularity. So I've been surprised at times at forwards for books that are for conservatives, but they're not for feminists. And these are people that have had 30 years in the movement. I do think that the internet has transformed politics to the extent that the audience capture and the rage farming actually tilts people's perspectives from what they ostensibly believe. That's different to the disagreement you're talking about. That's medium as the message. So the like machine and the rage farming sits underneath all of it. It's like, if we go Marxist, it's the superstructure. And then you've got the ideological disputes within that, and they're class-based. Because if you look into the backgrounds of some of them, they're really in the establishment already.
But Janice Turner worked for the Times.
Yeah.
Helen Joyce
Was the
worked for
editor of The
Feminist.
Economist.
So
Times.
these are people whose jobs are not in jeopardy. While the women who are coming out were coming out saying, it's not cool to use wrong sex pronouns. None of these women were going and harassing women in their workplace who were using she, her pronouns for trans activists because of compelled to do it. They were talking about women who did it by choice, and Janice Turner did it by choice, and she then defended it and said she was doing it out of respect for this man who was an admitted fetishist. So, these are anonymous women, and then they got criticised for being anonymous on Twitter. And then Andrew Doyle came out and really savaged them. He slighted a lot of women. He's called them stupid.
He said that they were homophobic, did he?
Recently, he's come out and said, well, he said it before, but he's come out and said, which is one of the Dennis's shticks too. And I was a bit naive to that. People told me, look, you're friends with this guy and this is what he's thinking. And I was a bit naive. At my age, I was a bit ashamed of myself for that. But there is an anti-feminism there. And because they're smaller in number, in the gender critical, the gay guys are smaller in number, but they want to take disproportionate control. And they want to get their nose into feminism, and they have no place. So we come forward with a feminist critique and we say no. From the feminist perspective, the first thing I said was women are structurally oppressed. Then I said I'm on the side of women who want to repeal the GRA. This is a principle of our movement. And what I said, which got me the massive amount of trouble, was that he said, why are there these women abusing? Well, pronouns have become a picket line in the gender critical. And that was the analogy I used. And I said, as soon as you cross that picket line, you're going to get them screaming. And that's what they're doing. They're saying, this is a picket line, you've crossed it. And then all hell broke. I never knew middle-class people were so sensitive about being called scabs. And he said, how dare you call her a scab? Well, I didn't directly. I used that analogy, but yeah, she's a scab. In that analogy, she's a scab. They're saying scab, scab, scab. Yeah. So then Helen Joyce soft-blocked me, all the people. But Bertie Rose, who's quite popular, she alongside with her, a whole bunch of people. Because I said this analogy, and even now, one of the popular podcast guys came to me and was coming against me, and I said, well, what did I do exactly? You tell me, because I knew he didn't know, he didn't understand, he wasn't smart enough. And he said, I'll go and find out. And I knew he knew Dennis, so he's gone to Dennis, and Dennis has given him these tweets. And he said, well, you called women scabs. Well, and so that was my sin, right? So then they got the narrative. No, she's not a good one. She's a bad feminist. Yeah. So they developed a group of feminists that we call ultras now, who are uncompromising on a couple of issues. And they're the problem. They're the problem because they're authoritarian. They're like Nazis, and that Rudy, who called me a Nazi, later on he came, he was caught on audio saying the most revolting things about who's a black feminist in our movement, really terrible. So they reveal their misogyny. and they try and hide it, but it just sees out.
Well, I think the other thing is it's like the fight between Matt Walsh and Megan Mercy. I think they had disagreements over that film, and she said, look, the thing is, we've been doing this, small scale feminist organizations, her, feminist current. I mean, I don't know. She thinks to have flipped on feminism now, but she was making the point that there's a lot of traction to be gained and now money out of the fight, right? So the right come in and go, this is a culture war issue and we can stir it up and we can do. And I think that film is funny and interesting, by the way, but it's still the case that the women that have been talking about this for many decades now, actually, because this was a fight in women, a niche little fight within women's studies 20 years ago.
And we are experts in the field.
Yes.
We are experts in this field because we've made ourselves experts.
That's
they
right.
won't acknowledge it.
We lived that change. Then that culture war entered into the wider culture. The disagreement within feminism moves out here in the wider culture, gets picked up by all these, the funding and the sexology. And it also gets picked up by grifters who literally want to use this issue to build their own following. What's happened is I think that the coterie of sanctioned feminist voices have complex stakes in these. They get platformed on a lot of those right wing, or I guess it's a version of classical liberal, but not one that you and I necessarily agree with. But they get platformed over here,
And the biggest market is the American market.
That's right. And so turning on you and turning you into a straw woman they can all oppose and call a Nazi, which is like, that's just become everyone's a Nazi now who's not in agreement with something. It's absurd. But I think there's also this backstory about the monetization of the conflict itself. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. Well, and then it became centered around Redux as well. Anna from Redux is very controversial. She likes to stir up the gay guys. And I said some things which I said I disagree with. I don't agree with it. I said it was dodgy. I, don't follow her. I don't know her. But then they turned it on Redux and Genevieve Gluck.
Intense articles where she really goes into pretty dark material about the child sexual abuse.
She does. She's very respectful as well. And of course, Redux has a few different writers. They wanted to cancel Redux. Dennis had told me that a long time ago. He would never share anything anytime I'd say, I'd love to sing from Redux or talk about something like Elon Musk sharing Redux. He would say it's not very good. And they harked back to saying, oh, well, because Anna has said this terrible thing and because of the AIDS crisis, well, every day is an AIDS crisis for women, right? This is our only resource. And you can come against her. Someone else can contextualize it. I don't care. I'm not going to go and try and cancel her. When you've supported people like, there was a guy called Curtis years ago, Curtis Tripp. He was the most misogynistic guy you've ever met. Gay guy, platformed by Dennis. All the gay guys loved him. But he turned out to be, he was arrested on terrorist charge at some point. Really awful, awful man. And the same with Rudy. They all say they're wonderful. So there's problematic figures who play problematic things. But ultimately, there's a principle that we're sticking to. That's that women are real, women are oppressed. If we're allowed to be, we need protections in law. But the key difference, we came against drag because there's a feminist critique of drag and there's a feminist critique of surrogacy. Yes. We don't think that gay men have a natural right to women's bodies, reproductive processes for money.
No, we do not.
We disagree with that. You and I could disagree on an issue and still maintain hostility. I won't call you a Nazi and you won't call me this. But they crossed that. They said, no, we're going to try and cancel this magazine. Then I said that a group of men who are trying to cancel a magazine that really exposes pedophiles and fetishes is suspicious.
Disturbing. And that whole fight around the so-called woke right, it's the same thing, wanting to shut down speech. Wasn't that what we were saying was a problem? Like, you're saying you want to sack Kathleen Stock because she's a sex realist or a gender critical feminist, and yet they're now wanting to shut down your speech or Genevieve Gluck's speech. So it's fascinating to me how the whole argument is we don't shut down speech. We disagree with each other. Yeah. And even blocking is extraordinarily immature. I'm not saying people don't have a right to do it. I'm asking liberal. You want to block someone, block them. But I find it a shallow and immature response to a disagreement. Have the disagreement. Yes, you've got years behind you of articles that they know that you're a complex and interesting thinker. Like I have realised we disagree probably on the Israel-Palestine issue. And yet I don't see that means we can't have a conversation or engage. I just find it fascinating that this capacity for disagreement, for civil disagreement, is disappearing at a rate of knots, even among those who purport to be its saviours.
Issues, as you say, that we don't have any.
You froze completely. I didn't hear the last thing you said, but do make your point, because I think it's an important one about you were talking about, well, the one point was that, you've got gay men wanting to shut down a feminist organisation that's exposing some of the kind of shadows in the pedophilic culture. But the other side of it is the freedom of speech piece. Go on.
Yes, I can't remember what I was saying. I think the issue is that these are issues some of them we don't have any influence on. Like, for instance, the Israel-Palestine issue, you and I are never going to influence that. But there's a fake democratic claim that because we think bad things, like the claim is that there's a certain section of the community, the gender critical community, that are not criticising gay men because they're men or because they're endorsing practices which have been criticised by feminists for decades, but because we're homophobic, which is unsustainable. Because if you go to a women's protest, any women's protest that we have, you can't throw a rock without hitting a lesbian. There's so many lesbians in our movement that you can't call us homophobic. What they're calling us is misandrous against gay men. So a particular type of misandry, which is what they said. And one guy said to me, she said, she hates women, is what Andrew Doyle said. And one guy said, yeah, she blocked me probably because I'm a man. That guy who said that had to settle something with one of Redux's workers because he'd made these, saying outlandish things and then saying, oh, it's probably because I'm a man or because they're homophobic. No, you won't engage in debate. You're not engaging in debate. You're calling us names and you're doing the classic thing that men do. Men should not be involved in women's politics. I'm absolutely convinced that they should stay in their own lane. If they want to advocate for surrogacy, for drag, for all those things, advocate for them. But just know we're going to critique them because that's what feminists have always done.
And that's why feminism remains unpopular. So they'll attach onto the culture war issues around the category of woman and around freedom of speech. But there's something deeply unpopular, and it remains the case before, during, and after these debates, with women calling out the structural oppression of their own sex and gaining traction at the level of the state to secure their rights and liberties.
Yes.
Yes. And
they don't like it.
We don't want the sexualization of children. We don't want the commodification of women's bodies. And we want to secure women's access to education, access to the capacity to own property and also raise children inside marriages, but also outside them if they're abusive. And all of these things, like you say, they can't be just put back in the box. And women raising these issues, amongst that coterie of sort of funded feminists, there's, all these issues they talk about are always centered on the category of women. They never want to go back to things like domestic violence. Have you noticed that? Or sexual assault. These topics are gradually disappearing and being replaced by the debate itself on the category of women. I understand why, because it's foundational. We can't really go anywhere without it. I do understand that. But I also think there's been a dropping off, a sloshing off of key feminist tenets.
Yes. Or weaponizing them to sort of promote the funding of whatever their thing is. Like with domestic violence, it's always, this terrible tragedy has happened. Therefore, we need to give more money to Our Watch, who are an organisation who make brochures pretty much and who just fund each other, who you want a $200,000 a year feminist. I mean, I'd love to be paid $200,000 a year to be a feminist, but unfortunately, the money just corrupts. The money will corrupt people. And we do need to have voices like Megan Murphy. And I understand why she's backtracked a bit, because the pressure on someone like her, she's been in it a long time. She's good friends with Joe Rogan. She's struggling. You can tell she's struggling to make a living. She doesn't earn a huge amount of money.
Yeah, I know, it's a struggle.
So she can't crack it. She's articulate. She's a beautiful woman. She's intelligent, but she can't crack it. She can't crack the thing that dummies like James Lindsay have cracked.
Yeah.
But even though he's a dope.
And that's that piece where, I don't know if it's only gender because it can be a range of things and it's mercurial. But yeah, she's got all the qualities and yet just not getting anywhere. And yet other people, like I'm thinking about the incredible rise of some of the post-liberal feminists like Louise Perry and Mary Harrington. They are smart and they're saying interesting things. They also piggyback onto a whole lot of very regressive anti-feminist, there's Serena Joys, and yet I don't know.
Yeah. Well, this trad wife thing,
Yeah.
it's insane. And they come up and they're the trad wife, they've got all these, 2 million followers or whatever. That's their living. They work. Like they're promoting women not working.
Exactly.
That's your job.
Yeah, something that's fake, which is another thing I find with the Serena Joys. It's like they're always advocating for the very thing they're not doing. Because by virtue of the advocating and the blogging and the podcasting and the book writing, they're not staying at home with their little kids. In fact, I don't even understand how they can write so prolifically while having toddlers. It doesn't make sense to me. I could never write that much. I took forever to do my thesis because I was mothering. But yeah, I think there's definitely some duplicity there. And there's also a kind of weird anti-feminism that's called feminism. And I find that I don't like the duplicity of that,
No, I don't know.
No, it's like, because that then gets your platform to make a straw woman of feminism.
It's very postmodern is always my thought, because they move away from structural analysis into kind of philosophical and, aesthetic analysis, where they're always finding the middle. It's, one of these, like this German, what was it, Friedrich, I can't remember his name, Schiller. Always finding the middle, the aesthetic, the perfect aesthetic, moving away from structural analysis. That's what postmodern was. They were moving away from structural theory. I'm back at structural theory. It's what anchors me. Otherwise, if I look at something, if it's a class analysis, if it's a feminist analysis, if it's a classic liberal analysis, it just anchors me.
Yeah, I agree. It's postmodern also because they claim to reject that whole development of identity politics and queer theory and so on. And they often will mobilize the idea of class in order to make that argument while themselves flipping on it, right?
They're departing from Western traditional political thought to try and make up their own philosophy. They claim it's actually ancient philosophy when it's, they claim it's like from the earth. It's very new age, isn't it? Yeah.
There's just duplicity all the way through.
Cancel people for marginal things, like based on their power and their influence, which is classic elitism, right?
Exactly.
Like the way they were trying to cancel me or did cancel me, UK gender critical elite, was just made up. I'm a Nazi. And thankfully Genevieve Black did come out, and I couldn't believe how happy I was when she said it. Of course, Edie's not a Nazi. She said, and I remember thinking, oh, thank God someone said it. It's like,
Did you say Kathleen Stock backed you as well?
no, she blocked me.
Oh, she blocked you.
Yeah, because there was this kind of idea that there was a group of women, a gang of women who were attacking Stella O'Malley and Andrew Doyle, and that these women were bad and had to be marginalised.
Yeah.
And because I gave a political analysis to that, I said, actually, what we're seeing is a picket line scenario. I was seen as the leader, which is ridiculous, obviously.
So there's a class level, but there's also standard schoolgirl tactics here, where the core group, they're the ones that are platformed everywhere, closed ranks and made you the outsider.
Like organising message groups.
There's something where the medium has changed, so it's all personal now. If you did that in an academic paper 10 years ago, it would have been a problem. No one's blocking anyone. This is a live wire situation, so there's that. It's the schoolyard again. And then I think that within that, the schoolyard, they'll close ranks regardless of the fact that they may or may not actually align with your position. So I know what you're saying about the wishy-washy, because I know that she has in some cases supported gender ID, but at the same time, she's pretty firm on category of woman stuff in my reading. But
and I always supported that too.
Yes, but closing ranks with her buddies is part of what's happening there, I think. And that's unfortunately the new tribalism that's happening on the internet. But I have to finish there, Edie, because I've got to clean the Airbnb, which is where I am. Yeah, no, it's great to chat.
You too.
Enjoyed it. And I'll let you know when this goes up. It'll probably be about a week, and because I have to edit it all and all that. And Yeah, I hope to chat with you again.
It was a good conversation.
Welcome to the Veritas podcast, where we explore heterodox thoughts on politics, sex, and culture with an exciting lineup of international guests. I'm your host, Dr. Petra Buskins, and I'll be asking guests, what is it that distinguishes this political and cultural moment? Why isn't the world making sense anymore? What is reality in an algorithmically driven world? How can we regenerate our psyches and societies?